Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of Making Vinyl Online. Today's session is scheduling your vinyl release, and it's being moderated by Chuck Gorman. So it's a pleasure right now to turn it over to Chuck, and I'll let him go ahead and introduce the other panelists that we have with us today.
Thanks, Brian. We have three great people here to talk about scheduling your vinyl release. First, Gene Zacharewicz, who has over 20 years experience dealing with everything around vinyl. He was most recently with Universal Music. He's currently doing some consulting in this space right now. We have Melanie Pillette, who is the Vice President of Production and Digital Fulfillment at Better Noise Music. And Melanie has worked with artists ranging from Mark Ronson and the Rag and Bone Man to Motley Crue and the Bad Wolves. Then we have Alex Cushing. Alex is the president of Hand Drawn Records, which is a pressing facility in Dallas, Texas. And then, again, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm a retail and distribution and generally all things analog and physical goods consultant to the music space. So we want to get started talking about scheduling your release. And this is going to be sort of a freewheeling conversation. We'll have some pauses where if there are any questions that are building up, we can make sure that we get to them and address them. And what we're really going to start with is at the very beginning of the process. You're starting to plan a recording, or maybe you actually have a recording, or you're even mid-recording sessions. And we want to talk about how we want to start with a clear plan. And that's really, in some ways, the most important thing about this session is if you walk away with anything, it's make sure you plan it. Don't just wing it. There's just too many moving parts here. And what you'll want to know is what type of a release do you want to do? Is there a specific audience that you're trying to reach? Will this end up being sort of a no frills release, just a 140 gram, single color vinyl, basic jacket and sleeve? Are you thinking about doing any customization or anything special for an individual account? And will it be sold in retail accounts in store or just online? And then what's your desired release date and where are you in reference to that? And that may be equally as important as having a plan is knowing sort of those two dates, where you are in the process and when you want to have the record come out. So why don't we start off by turning it over to Alex for a minute. Alex has a wide background in supply chain management prior to being the president of a pressing facility. And let's just start talking about making a plan. Alex?
Yeah, and thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. Yeah, as we were thinking about this, and I think we're going to go through a lot of very tactile and very sort of specific steps that we can all walk away with after this on how to get this done. But at this top level, I think when you're thinking about this, what is vinyl and why am I doing it is a big question. The whole idea of pre-recorded music was for artists to get their voice out, hear me, right? That's the whole point, is I have this and I want to be heard. And, the evolution of that has gone from, early sheet music to where we are today. And that's what streaming and, downloading is great for, is here I am, hear me. What's interesting about vinyl and why I think it continues to reemerge and where we are with it now is that it in its element, in its actual structure, it allows for an additional conversation to allow the artist to bring the fan to them and have a different conversation beyond just hear me. It's also feel me and see me. So all this is to the point is as you're in these early stages of planning, to really think about what this vehicle is going to be for you. And it might be just that. I have fans, they want to hear me. I just need the record to give them that choice. But there is an opportunity to use the medium for more. And if you're thinking about that in the process, while you're creating the music or just afterwards, while you're still in the studio mastering, is there an opportunity to add, photographs or liner notes or different sorts of additions to the record? Is that important for what you're trying to do? How does the color of the disc from a marketing perspective perspective play into that. Especially now if it's so much B2C, direct to consumer was my point, versus distribution right now, which is a little interrupted. That will come back. The vinyl plays into that. So all this to say is there's an amazing opportunity for the artist to think about this being that they created, this album of music that they created, and think about the physical aspect of it. Are there going to be things that I want to add to it? How do I want to use the jacket and the inserts and all of these things to tell this story? And that's, at this point, super important, because those are going to be the keys to deciding additional print that you'll need, different support, different size, even the physical boundaries or the sandbox of how much music you can put on each side of disc, and having louder music up front versus the back. These are all critical decisions to having a final product that delivers a tremendous experience and extends what it is that you want to do as an artist. So the earlier you do that, which is what this whole point of all of this is hopefully we give you those things to make those decisions, because I think you'll hear from all of us is these great ideas are happening, and they're happening so late that they're either causing a possibility of not happening at all because it's too late to do these things, or the costs become insanely prohibitive. So understanding where you want to go for this up front, and or at least sketching that out, is critical.
Those are all great points. Melanie, I mean, you've worked with such a wide range of artists. Is there anything you'd add to that?
I just think it's good to think about what you want to do beforehand, before even thinking about a release date, because that is the starting of what can hold the process up. So if you are looking at something like, oh, I do want to do the special packaging, or I do want to do a special color, or these kind of things, it helps you, before you get to the next step of setting the budget, it helps you just know the basics of what you're getting into. And if you think about that in the studio, you can prep, like Alex said, you can prep for those things. You can take some extra photos in the studio for this. You can just prep for the fact that you will need extra stuff, which takes extra time.
And Gene, is there anything you'd add? I mean, Gene has worked with pretty much anyone that you've heard of at one point in time or another in his career. Is there anything you'd add to that list?
I just tend to be very pragmatic. And so I'm always worried about costs, and every choice that you make, there's a cost associated with it. And so you want to make sure that the choices that you're making, you can deliver on, because at the end of the day, it really comes down to the music. And yeah, I know what happens is you can get caught up in, I want to have 3-color splatter and all the bells and whistles. But then what happens is that the end product becomes prohibitively expensive to your customer, or to your fan, basically. And so you want to make sure, as you're going through this process, basically, why am I doing this? That's a big question. And also, I've worked with a lot of bands where, some bands, of course, have all the money in the world and cost and doesn't matter. But then there are other bands who are just starting out, or artists are starting out, where funds are really tight. And unfortunately, in this process, sometimes what ends up happening, you have to pay for things as you go along. And then at the end of the day, you don't have enough money actually to press the record at the end of the day, because of the way the money has gone through. And all of a sudden you're like freaking out, basically, because I can't get my product and I'm going on the road. I guess it just ties back to, and it's long-winded, just make sure when you're making your choices, why you're making them, and be very careful. I mean, I can't stress that point enough, is how to be careful, basically.
That's a great segue into the next section, which we were going to talk about, sort of how do you set a budget, and what does that get to? Ultimately, I think you need to be thinking about, what do you want to be able to sell your record for to your fans? What do you think is the right value, and what do you think is the right price that they're going to be able to participate with you at? Why don't we touch on budgeting for a moment, and then we'll pause and look at any of the questions we've gotten through the Q&A at this point. So Do you want to start this one off, Melanie?
Sure, I can start this one off. I mean, ultimately, you, like we were saying, want to look at who you're selling this to, who your fans are, what level of, I don't want to say income, but what level of fandom you're selling to. So if you are a well-established band who's been around for years, you can set higher price points because people are willing to spend that kind of money. But if you're a younger baby band, you want to set lower price points for your products because you'll be able to sell more and sell it on tour, and you'll be able to make that quick sale. So if you are a touring band that has, like, in small venues, you want to ensure that you set the manufacturing cost a bit lower so you can set the selling cost lower. So if you make it too fancy, if you go for heavyweight, splatter color, matte finish, all these bells and whistles, your manufacturing cost is going to be too high for the audience that you're selling it to. You want to think about that. And then when it refers to making sure you start your artwork and get the audio ready, you need to ensure that you go to someone who can master the audio for the vinyl, because you can't just go to a normal person. You can't just take normal WAV files, send it to vinyl, and just ensure that it's going to work perfectly. You can ensure that you're mastering it for the format that you're making. And then that leads into artwork. Artwork for me, from a production standpoint, is the actual biggest holdup, because usually when they approach us, the audio's done. So the audio is ready, they give us the audio, but no one's really thought about the parameters of the artwork. Maybe you've picked a designer, but some people pick a designer that hasn't worked in audio products before. Audio products have a specific layout. They need specific formats to be made. And so these are the things that then hold the process up. So you want to pick a designer, especially if you don't fully know what you're doing. If this is your first vinyl, pick a designer who's done it before, because they can hold your hand in the process. They know what they're doing. And then when it comes to having the label copy ready, you need to ensure that the label copy is finished, because that's what the designer is going to use to make the artwork. And the more you have it unfinished, the more edits you'll have. And then the more edits you'll have, the more money you spend, which then goes back to the budget.
Yeah, so, we're going to take a quick pause here. Alex or Gene, is there anything you'd add to budgeting at this point?
Yeah, just real quickly, from my perspective, all points well taken. As you're looking at the budgeting, there's a lot of different physical real estate on the record, and all of it has cost implications. Splatters, so doing things to the vinyl itself versus doing things to paper products. So all my thing around the budgeting is, depending on what the message you're trying to get out there and what's important to you creatively, is you can do a lot of interesting things on different parts of the whole physical medium. Don't just focus down on just the disc itself. Interesting ways to add etchings, use the label differently, think about the jacket in a different way. There might be some opportunities to get all the messages out there that you want, and actually possibly save a little money or find different opportunities.
Yep.
So
Would
just
you say
be
the
like
key
everything
point,
else,
Alex,
be creative with your budget.
right, what I was going to say is, do you think the key point is knowing where you want to go, and then knowing what you want to accomplish with the record, and knowing the point of the release, and then you can go back to the budget from there much more easily?
I would probably say knowing what you want to do with this physical medium. What is it to you? Is it, again, just to hear me, or is it something else? And then I actually would say the release date's probably after you figure out, basically, I need to be at this price point for this product. Here's what I can play with. Because if I think that I'm going to be selling a $40 disc versus a $15 disc, that's a huge gap.
Right.
Yeah, only thing I also would add is that.
Yeah.
Gene?
Yeah, I was just going to add also, I know at this point we've basically been talking about sort of the appearance of the vinyl and the packaging or anything of that nature, but also, there's the other avenue where you may want to make a serious audiophile version of whatever you're doing, because let's face it, most of the people have experienced your music probably streaming, and which is, as we all know, the sound quality is inferior. And I know myself, I kind of stream like I used to listen to the radio, where all of a sudden I hear music and all of a sudden, wow, I really like this band or this artist. I want to get to know them better. And now I've taken that extra level of commitment. And now my extra level of commitment is actually buying a physical piece from that artist. And one of the reasons why I'm buying that physical that piece from that artist, and this is completely my anecdotally me. I'm not talking for anybody else. It's like, I want it for the audiophile experience. I want to have that sound quality. So for me, the colored vinyl doesn't mean as much. It's really that I am getting something where I know the sound quality is going to sound great on my stereo at home. So I think it's another thing that we need to think about at the same time.
Yep, those are good points. We want to take a quick pause here, and Brian has a poll that he's going to put out there, and there's a handful of questions that have come through on the Q&A already, and we'll address a few of these now. The ones we don't get to, we will make sure that they get addressed on Making Vinyl so you can actually see them. But the first one, and I think it's a really good question, frankly, is Alex has spoken about the importance of how you sequence your tracking, which on a vinyl record is obviously different than what you would do for a streaming, for a playlist, or even for a CD. So who wants to handle that one, the question around the sequencing?
I can give it from a technical perspective, and then maybe you guys can add some color to that.
Absolutely.
Sorry, should I see the question? Am I supposed to be?
No, it's under the Q&A, but it's basically, it was just, it was around the, basically you had made the comment about the importance of sequencing and the louder tracks first and what that meant for production.
Great. Yeah. So absolutely. So in general, I mean, the boundaries of what is vinyl is about 17 to 23 minutes per side. Depending what kind of format it is and what kind of music, there might be a little more, but that's really 18, 19 minutes is the sweet spots per side. So and we see this all the time is, you know, it used to be when vinyl was the premier distribution point, whole albums were produced around those sort of boundaries and that sandbox. What we learned is particularly is that the louder music out front gives you a little more room. If you try to put a lot of louder tracks in the inside, you're going to get possibility for tracks getting too compressed, and the needle pops around, and you lose. You know, there's all sorts of audio implications to that. So understanding the track listing, how many tracks you have, you know, we're in a world which is fantastic of limitless right now, is as many tracks as I want to put out, and I call an album, and they can be as long as I want because it's streaming and digital, is all great. And I think creatively it's exciting, but there are some natural boundaries to the medium itself. So that actually ends back up to budgeting is, depending how long this is, you might be forced into a double LP, and what does that mean for your customer base? So again, going back to Melanie's point, why are we doing this? And, you know, does that make sense for me? Is sort of the technical side of things.
Yep. And Melanie, you dealt with digital as well as physical, frankly. So would you have any color that you'd add to what Alex just said?
Well, I agree with what Alex just said. The problem is with digital, you can be like, oh, I want this, you know, 18 track release. All the tracks are 5 to 6 minutes long, and then they move it over to vinyl, and they're actually surprised that it ends up being a 2-disc or whatever, and then they are surprised by how much more expensive that is compared to what they were thinking. And so then they have to pare it down. And I've come across this probably a lot more than you would think. Is I tell them what they can have per side, and it comes back to be a 2 LP, and they're like, oh, we can't afford that. That wasn't in the budget. And then they have to either not do a vinyl, make the vinyl really sparse. So like standard weight, standard finish, everything standard, so it doesn't become a special product. So when you're thinking about vinyl, you need to think about the time and the budget and know that, you know, 20 minutes max per side, if that, and think about your track listing for that.
Yep, those are good points. The next question we have actually, I think, is a great one for you, Gene. And it's
Okay.
about wondering about the weight of the vinyl. And, you know, what's the difference between 140 and 180? And while 180 is advertised, is there actually a difference there? Or do you, some of this is subjective, obviously, but.
Some of it is subjective. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it. It really comes back to what's the source, the master source that you're using, basically. Like if someone said that they're using a digital master source and it's on 180 versus an analog source that's on standard weight 130, 140, I would say you're better off going with the 130, 140 with the master source of analog master source than a digital source on 180. So I think a lot of 180 is marketing. It's used for marketing, basically. It's supposed to sort of equal better sound. But in most cases, if you have a really good standard weight vinyl from a really good pressing plant, and your master source was an analog master source, and it was cut, the lacquer was cut very well, that is better than, probably a 180 from a digital source any day of the week. So I think a lot of 180 is just, a lot of it's marketing. I'd also like to just jump back for a quick second on your first question. I don't think people remember this, but I sure do. It's like when CDs were first introduced, LPs and CDs had different tracks. What I'm saying is that usually, because of the limit of what you could put on an LP, which was only about 40 to 45 minutes worth of music, and on a CD was 70 minutes worth of music, you would buy a CD of the same release that had maybe 5 or 6 more cuts than the LP, and that was a fairly accepted practice back in the beginning. I guess what I'm saying is that there's not, even if all of a sudden you do something digitally that has 100 minutes, doesn't mean you have to put all 100 minutes on the LP, and it might even save you somewhere down the road for doing another release of things that didn't make it on the LP.
Well, exactly. That was a marketing tool. If you can only put so many songs on it, then later you can add some when you have more of a budget to deal with, and then you can make the double LP.
Yeah, I'll say that as someone from more of the marketing side, that we always looked at 180 as being a hook when we did a exclusive edition or a special edition for a brand. And, to Melanie's point, we loved it when a band came to us and said, we've got all these tracks that we didn't get on the first record or on the second record that we did. They're mastered, they're ready to go. Can we find a way to put them out in something? That was the best possible situation. We want to sort of swing into the next point, which is around just making sure your rights are cleared and assigned. And there's actually a question around this as well. So why don't we start with just talking about, how do you make sure your rights are in place and you have them? And Gene, this is something right in the sweet spot of everything you've been doing for so many years. Why don't you start this one off for us?
Well, of course, I mean, if you're working with the band that's done the recording, the assumption is that, you have, the band through their contract with the label, you have the rights to do it. And with all the consents that go along with that. Now, perhaps though, the band has used some guest musicians, and those guest musicians are signed to a different label. Well, then you have to go make sure that they have those consents in place with that different label. And of course, if you're dealing with musicians that are not part of the band who have played on it, of course, you have AFM issues that you have to make sure you have dealt with. And then, of course, on top of that, there's a producer, you have that piece to deal with. And then also, of course, the mechanicals and making sure that you're administrating the mechanicals. So there's a lot of rights that need to be dealt with. Of course, I can hand it over to Alex because, most plants because they're in a legal liable position if they actually press a record that that all of a sudden all the rights aren't covered, and they could be sued, so it can be very serious. So you really have to make sure that everything has been sort of administered, and it's a tedious process, but it's you know.
Yep.
As you said,
would you recommend that, especially if it's a band who's doing this for the first time, that they coordinate with one person, they get someone who's really experienced with rights management, probably an attorney who can
or someone that that's been in the business for a long time and knows exactly what to look for and how to administer those rights, basically. So, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And before we turn it over to Alex, I just wanted to ask Melanie, because she deals with rights, physical and digital, both to a degree. Is there anything you'd add to that?
No, I agree that you need someone experienced, especially if you're not a label and you're not set up to do that and you don't have that infrastructure in place. If you bring someone on that's to deal with your rights management, that's one less worry that you as a band, when you're making this album, need to worry about. And it's also, you need to remember to add mechanicals into your budget, because that is the one thing that I feel like maybe gets forgotten, and then you end up getting a fee, and that's like what, however many cents per track, and you put all these tracks on this album, and then you're like, why is it this much money? Because you didn't calculate in the mechanical license.
And Alex, from your perspective as a plant, how do you handle this when someone comes to you with a project? Do you have a specific form you need them to fill out? Is there a specific way you manage this process?
Absolutely, and I'm pretty sure it's pretty close to the same for anybody. Before we even start working with anybody, and after we start discussing with a label or a band directly of what the quotes in our budget and things like that is, we ask for some standardized forms to be filled out. We do a what we call an opening job form, specifically tell us what you want, so we're getting by all of the discussions. I thought you said 300, I thought you said 500, I didn't understand, so we put that in writing. But most importantly is a rights release form that indemnifies us, that says we've asked you, have you checked that you have your rights all lined up. It really doesn't completely indemnify us. I think Gene's point is well taken. It is always nerve-wracking, but it at least says that we check that you checked, and because we are not going to check for you, and there's not going to be a plant that's going to spend the time. So part of your budgeting is, I know particularly for left-brain creative people, speaking to lawyers is always a painful process, but money well spent.
Well, and that's well said, because these are creative people. This is the last thing they're going to think about, and probably the last thing they're going to want to think about.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think we've all of us on the panel have had experiences with rights and clearances or lack thereof. So we want to move into mastering.
And don't forget the photo rights either. I didn't even speak about that.
Oh, that's right.
and just how I just brought that in was like, because a lot of times the photo rights aren't thought of because you're dealing with the sound, and then all of a sudden you get a cease and desist letter because there's a photograph in the package that no one got the rights for, and you're like, oh yeah. So it's not just, I know we just basically talked about the content, the audio content, but don't forget the any photography or anything like that as well.
Yeah. Image rights and also liner note rights can be an issue also, depending on where you're taking them from and if they were a work for hire or not.
Yeah, and that leads back to the beginning of this, where you need to think about your artwork as much as you're thinking about your audio in the process, because that is the kind of stuff that always comes up later, and then it takes a week or two to figure it out, which then delays the whole process.
Yep. And Alex, since we kind of got there anyway, and as the guy running the plant, what happens when you get that week or two delay? What happens to the release typically?
Yeah, before I get into that, that rabbit hole on rights just real quick is not only do you have the rights to the photograph, but there's a national brand in the photograph that you don't have ability to use. So the photograph, the photographer was happy with it, but whatever branded company doesn't want to be in there, that's a nightmare too. But directly to your question, is yeah, any delay, basically we're working with you directly or your label, and we have a very specific timeline that we're working for a street date that you want, and then we put it in our production cycle. So any delay from even, you know, when you get your test presses, which we're going to talk about later, spending a week and a half, 2 weeks with them, or I don't have the rights and I need to go back to the lawyer, basically puts you back in the queue. And I know nobody wants their street date to move, but just because, you know, every day that you're moving your approval moves the production date. It's a direct correlation, and it's more than a direct correlation. It's not one-to-one. One day can actually throw you weeks behind because of the queue and how we schedule out our production. So it's really critical to make that happen, because it almost ends up going back to the line.
Yep.
Back
So we want to touch
in the
on
back of the
mastering.
line.
Yep, we want to touch on mastering here for a moment and then move right into artwork from there. So mastering, you know, there's a variety of different choices you can make. And why don't we start with you on this one, Melanie, because you probably deal with this across multiple formats and multiple distribution methods. So,
Well, for mastering specifically, since I've been back in the US working at an indie label, we use digital files and submit that. But when I was working at Sony, it was all lacquers. And so if you're worried about sound, lacquers is the way to go. But if you're worried about budget, I mean, sending digital files isn't great, but it saves that level of money. And so that's the level of which I dealt with it. When you go to the smaller budget things, we deal with digital masters.
yep. And has anyone on the panel, has anyone had any issues around going to a lacquer right now because of the issues with Apollo and some of the other just sort of supply chain things that have come up here?
Yeah, it is a lot harder to come by. I know that it's right now very difficult to get. Let's just put it that way. I think you're going to start seeing solutions towards the end of this year and into early next year. But from the mastering perspective, at least starting in digital is acceptable and really the only way to go right now.
Yeah, I think by the end of this year, I think there's two places from Europe I think are going to come online that are going to provide lacquers. And I know that there are, you know, two mastering studios in the States that I can't, for some reason, I can't remember the lacquers that come from Japan. I can't remember the name of the actual place. So it's the other, there's only two in the world. There's Apollo and this other one. And this other one has a limited supply. And so what ends up happening is that those lacquers come to a couple of mastering studios in the States, but those get gobbled up by the big boys right away. So everybody else is kind of left with crumbs.
And I think and as a smaller label, you go to digital because you also have to fight with the majors for time.
Yep. Exactly.
Yep, and digital can be a quicker process to test pressing as well in some cases.
And by the way, I think there's actually a debate going on between DMM and lacquers, where actually I think some engineers feel that if, for instance, like if it's a heavy metal recording or a rap recording, it's louder, some engineers actually prefer DMM versus lacquers because they feel like the bottom on it is better than lacquers. So
Yep.
I won't get into that debate myself, but that's what I've heard.
Yep. So
Yeah,
why don't we
sorry,
segue into artwork right now?
Sorry,
I don't
can
want
I
to
just
cut anybody. Don't want to cut anybody off, but we have a fair amount of stuff we want to cover here, and we don't want to run too far over time. So
Okay.
I know artwork is a huge issue, and it's often the last thing that anybody thinks about. And Melanie, why don't you kick us off on this one?
Well, I think I have covered the aspect of it is the last, because everyone's in the studio thinking about the music, thinking about the sound, and they're not thinking about artwork when they're thinking about the sound. It's kind of two different brain thoughts. And then the sound's done, ready to go. You send the audio, you get test pressings, and then you need artwork as soon as you need the audio to the manufacturer. Yes, you can get it in a little bit later, but you should have it ready in time. So you need to deal with them side by side with each other. And you need to get an appropriate, like I said earlier, you need to get an appropriate designer who knows what they're doing. So you can go, okay, this is what I want, and they can do it within the correct format and then the templates of the manufacturer. And that's another thing, is choosing the manufacturer is important, because every manufacturer has different templates that they want their products in. And if you don't have them set to the correct template, that's another week of retemplating.
Can anyone speak to the issue of the labels on the records themselves and the design and some of the issues that come up with those?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, from an artwork perspective, if you are working on a calendar and doing that, is label art is to us probably the first thing you want to look at before even jacket art. Now, obviously they have to connect and have a cohesive story, but we can move the process along by getting production if we have the label art ahead of the jacket art. So that's one thing when you, sorry, go ahead. So that's one way we could save. Having also said that is, we've come up with a proprietary label that we allow everybody in the industry to have, but the point of that is color saturations, and we look at colors. To get really technical, is most of the industry bakes labels and they put them in ovens to get some of the heat out, and I won't get too technical, but it does saturate the color and pull some of the color out of the labels is an opportunity. So particularly when you're using really bright colors and vibrant colors. Our version doesn't do that. It keeps the color fastness, but that's for a different story. But the point is as you're making those creative decisions, thinking about color usage and brights and whites, if you're going to be using bake labels versus non-bake labels.
Right. And we should clarify one thing before we move on here. There was a question that came through about when you're not using a lacquer, you're still going to need to make a stamper, and you're still going to have to deal with that.
Yep.
And I don't know if anyone wants to, anyone on the panel wants to speak to what happens to the process when you go DMM versus lacquer. What are, not from a sound quality perspective so much, but just from a logistical impact. We touched on it a little bit in terms of budget, but is there anything in terms of logistics that gives DMM a bit of an advantage in the short run, especially?
Not particularly. I mean, from our perspective, it's quite the opposite, both from a sound and a process perspective. DMM works in very certain circumstances, but in general, we prefer lacquer, and it seems to work better when making stampers for us. That's our perspective on it. I don't know if you have a different thought on that. In general, the process remains the same.
Yeah. Okay, good. So it's just really the source material to clarify to the comments we got there. Now, when it comes down to the artwork, and also we should talk a little bit about just proofing. And as part of proofing, we should talk about test pressing a little bit, which I know that everybody on the panel, we've all had various different experiences around test pressing, and seemingly every project you work on, there are unique things that come up there. But why don't we talk about proofing a little bit, and then we'll take a pause for some more questions. But just how do you, from a process perspective, what's the ideal way to handle proofing from your point of view? And why don't we start with Gene this time?
Well, I think it goes back to something that Melanie said a moment ago about how you have to do the artwork and the mastering, the mastering process at the same time, or work on on the sound at the same time. I mean, usually from my perspective, you want to have at least 3 people doing the proofing. Someone on the artist management side, someone on the label side, basically, and usually also have the person that's actually creating the artwork themselves doing the proofing as well. And because it just gives you that many more chances to find mistakes, because so many times 2 people just approve something and the 3rd person finds the mistake, and lo and behold, that mistake was there. It just it's just natural. I mean, you get tunnel vision. So, you look at something long enough, the mistakes there, you just kind of go over it. And the reason why also I think it's really important as you're doing the artwork, as you're working on the actual test pressing or the actual mastering process at the same time, I don't know how many times it's happened, but it's happened often enough where, label A became label B. And all of a sudden someone will be like listening to the test pressing and go, well, wait a second, side B has, side B is the way the artwork looks like supposed to be side A and vice versa. And pretty much everybody's missed it. And it's just because people are also looking for specific things and not, so the sound people are probably looking at sound and not really being aware of, okay, is this tracking the right way? And the print people are looking at the actual print. And so someone all of a sudden raises their hand and says, hey, yeah, the print is opposite of what's actually on the record. That's what's going on here? And that's happened more than once. It's not a unique thing. It's happened more than once. So as I said, the more people that you can find proofing, the better off you are. I guess that's the best I can say at the end of the day.
What you just mentioned is my nightmare, but like, oh my God, that would freak me out. This is why, so at major labels, they used to hire a proofreader to sit in the because of this, because you go blind to it. The designer's been staring at it, you've been staring at it, the product manager's been staring at it, but goes back to my statement earlier about the label copy. If you have the label copy done and dusted, that is your blueprint for the artwork. And it needs to compare to that. And your rights management person can look over it as well, just to make sure all the stuff that they're in control of is there. Someone like me can look over it to make sure all the product numbers are there that needs to be there. The track listing is correct. It's just, you need the steps so that those people can focus in on one thing versus having to look at the whole thing where you start to just like head spin. It's just a lot of words on a lot of color.
Yep. We had a question actually that's really apropos right now that came through. And has anyone ever worked with a client where the track listing changed after the labels were printed? And what did you do?
Scrap it.
Yeah. Scrapping labels isn't too bad. Scrapping jackets, depending on how expensive the jacket is, now that's a major cost, and that's happened as well. I mean,
I'm actually dealing with that at the moment. Luckily, we had a hold up with the artwork, so we hadn't gone to print with the artwork. But it's even, you have to think about, if you want to add a track, you have to go all the way back to the test pressing. So then you have to start from scratch again, replay, get new masters. And then as a budget, you got to factor in those costs. So you have to know what you're up against if you want to change things past the point. And it goes all the way to pre-production, because clearly you didn't think about it at the earlier point.
Yeah, for bands that are doing this on their own and we're working directly with them, we offer a sort of concierge service where we move through the whole process, like many other plants. We're not proofing that. We can't know what it is that you wanted. So what we do provide a proof is we get the digital files and we're putting it on another digital file that shows you this is the exact layout. So it is beholden to the artist directly to find those 2 or 3 resources to review it over and over again. We can't know what it looks like. We're just telling you what it is, and this is the file you gave us. And that even comes from sizing. We get the wrong size and we put it on the correct size, and some of the font gets squished. And so, looking at all those things, layout, how it changes the layout. Though we offer that, we're not doing the reproof. We're not actually proofing. We're just providing you the opportunity to look at that. And then somebody asked about barcodes. Obviously, if that's something you think you're going to need, working that space in is just leaving the open space is the most, if you're not sure yet, is the easiest solution. And there is a format for that and an exact size for that. So if you can leave that as an open space, the sticker can be applied later or at the last minute before you go to printing, you can always have the barcode put in. beyond that is, if you hadn't thought about it, is we can apply, and I'm sure everybody else can, a sticker either to the jacket or to the shrink wrap outside after it's done. A UPC sticker can be added. So again, that's not as detracting and sort of monumentally disruptive as track listing changes. The UPC can be addressed a lot of different ways.
Right. Can someone speak to, maybe Gene, you can start with this one off. Just how do you listen to a test pressing? What are you looking? We don't want to do, this could be a whole session in and of itself, obviously.
Yeah.
But
I guess for us, basically, I mean, my experience is typically you try to listen on 3 different types of turntables, and one is, and not to, you know, I don't know if there's any turntable manufacturers over here, but like one's a Crossley, you know, you picked up at Urban Outfitters. You know, I'm not trying to, you know, to degrade anybody, but you know, one is basically kind of a cheap turntable. One is sort of middle of the road turntable, and the other one is just a high-end turntable. Because you, of course, you want to try to emulate any type of turntable that someone might be listening to at home, basically. And, you know, and if something is skipping on one, you know, you have to figure out what's going on and why, or if it sounds really bad on one, why is it going on? Why is it happening? Plus the fact all of a sudden of the artist, if you're a label dealing with an artist and, you know, you get test pressings in-house and they sound great, and the you know, artist is saying, we hate the test pressings, you know, your first thing is, okay, what are you listening, you know, how are you listening to these test pressings, you know? So because as you just said, test pressings are very subjective, you know, at their base level, they don't have, there's pretty much no noise, and it's tracking well. So, but then if you start getting into sound quality, then it's like, you know, that's when you open up a can of worms.
As the plant operator, Alex, how do you deal with that when someone comes back to you and says, I hate my test pressing?
Yeah, so to touch on a little more what Gene said and answer that is, so a test pressing is exactly that. So what we actually include in all of our mail outs of test press is a little card that says, you know, this is what you're supposed to be looking for. These are presses that are made. These are probably the first time these are definitely the first time the stampers are in there, and they're going to be in there for a short run. Just for some general knowledge, when we go to production, ideally and probably we plan for the first 25 to 40 presses to be thrown away. That's just getting the metal work settled in, getting all the temperatures right. On the test pressing, that does not happen. We put it in, we take our best case, and we make 5 to 10 of them, and that's what you get. So these are not really meant for production quality. The whole purpose of a test press is, as Gene said, first of all, is the track listing in the way, is it your music? I can't possibly know that. I have the digital files, but then we check it. But is it your music that you expected? Is it in the order that you thought? Because we're getting it from the mastering. So, and then some general, you know, there's no massive popping. What we find happens all the time is 4 seconds are just gone. It's just the music's playing and then 4 seconds disappears and the music comes back, right? Or 6 seconds. I don't know if that was your intention or not, right? So that's what you're listening for. And then obviously some, you know, and that's why there's multiple test pressing. If you're getting a skip that's repeatable in the same spot across all the test pressing and very important on multiple decks, then we have a production stamper problem. That's what we're looking for. A pop here, a little noise artifact there, not important here. So we try to, it's an education process. You know, this is a new format for a lot of people. And it is exactly what it is it's just, is this your stuff? And or do we have any major problems going there? And so if you have, you know, bands that are really looking for, you know, the pure audiophile experience on the test press, it's just not going to happen. And it wasn't the intention that we made it. And to get the test pressing, we can't do that. We can't spend the hour or so setup time that we do for production when we're running 300, 500 thousands that we can just to get you 10, just so we can check that. So it's just expectation, setting expectation and talking about the education. And then I beg people to chai on different decks for sure. And there's a great app out there, RPM 33 1/3, and make sure that your deck is set up properly. Is it spinning at the right speed? Is your tone arm weighted properly? I mean, these are basic things. Now, generally, you should be able to put a record down and have it play. Depending on the music, though, there might be, and that's why it has all those features and functions, is to really get the deck to work properly.
Yep. Melanie, did you have something to add to this? I kind of cut you off there. I apologize for that.
Just about the doing it on a budget turntable, doing it on a mid-grade turntable. When at my previous job, we would do this because we had an album that everything, it went through A&R, test pressings were approved, and then the album came out. But because it was such a bassy album, it kept knocking the needle out of the low-grade turntables. So we, in turn, as a department, bought 3 tiers. So when it got approved, we ensured that we put it on the budget turntable to make sure that these kind of jumping needle issues didn't happen. Because back in the day when vinyl was a thing, we all knew the quarter trick. You put it on there, it weights the hand, whatever. But younger audiences don't know this, and they go to Urban Outfitters and they get the more budget turntables, and they end up having these issues that we don't see on the test pressing side because we're testing it on much higher end turntables.
I would just like to add another thing that's happened in sort of the resurgence and democratization of what's going on in the vinyl industry is that when this was all vertically integrated and, you know, all the big majors were running everything from, you know, you were in their studio to their mastering, to their pressing plant, to their distribution, and you had just vertical is they had actually very scientific and very locked in formulas for the mastering side of things. Now that we have tremendously creative mastering people out there looking to do and really working closely with the artists, pushing that sonic quality or those decisions to different levels when you have a particularly bass album or something at the super high end does have the ramifications that you cannot achieve a vinyl record without creating that problem. So what used to happen is that, like sort of right now compression, when MP3s, they take them and do that and just push them down to make sure they stream perfectly all the time. It was happening in vinyl back in the day. That's why people say to me, well, I have all these records and I put them down and they always work. It's because no matter what was going on with the music, they compressed them and made sure that it was working for across the 3 tiers. Now that we have sort of an open universe and people are making all sorts of creative decisions, this will happen. And the unfortunate side of that is the only way to fix it is, or there's 2 ways. One is knowing that some of them you're going to have some pushback, or you're going to have to go back and remaster it and change it. And we unfortunately come to that occasionally, you know, maybe twice a year, that the only way to get to the stop skipping is that we're going to have to go recut it. There's no other way around it.
Right. So we would ordinarily touch a little bit on marketing and distribution here, but rather than going there, we're running a little bit close to the time. And I think it makes a lot of sense to actually move into the decision-making process in terms of, are you going to work directly with a plant that manages the process for you? Are you going to work with a plant that really just presses and assembles packages? Or possibly are you going to work with a broker, and the broker will manage the process of selecting the plant? And why don't we touch on those 3 choices and how they could impact your output and also your timing? And if we have some time at the end, we can come back and talk about distribution and selection of different types of products for different channels. So
I don't know if I start. Obviously, I have a horse in this race, so you know.
Well, look, as long as we all acknowledge, I think everybody has a point of view here. So
you know, the whole point of why Hand Drawn got into pressing, and we opened up a pressing plant 5 years ago, was to deliver a particular type of interaction, and we had a mission statement and a reason for being, and it was to help independent artists and anybody looking for that sort of service, that sort of connection, and really sort of you know, getting their voice out to the consumer. So we have built a system that's really about working through being very targeted in your communication, of always knowing where things are and knowing who to talk to if there's questions. So we're built around that concept. You know, we're not.
I think it's
We've
fair to
never
not to
planned
cut
to
you
be.
off, but I think
Yeah.
it's fair to say that there's a number of plants that are sort of
Oh
working
yes.
in this same fashion. The Gene, could you touch on sort of the other choices for a second, like brokers versus sort of plants?
Well,
that
brokers basically, you know, probably people know A to Z Media, Empire Press, basically. Those are probably the most well-known, at least that I know of. The one nice thing about them is that, yeah, if you're essentially a new band, a new artist, and you don't know what to do, a new artist or label, and you have very little experience in this space, it's good to have someone that has had a lot of experience kind of walk you through the process a few times and can help you. You know, at the same time, like Alex with hand drawn, there are a number of sort of what I would call boutique plants, for lack of a better word, that can do the same thing. You know, as long as they have the time, because you know they could also be, you know, pressed for time depending on the time of year. The hardest thing I think is if all of a sudden you are going to do it by yourself and you start going to the larger plants, because those are the plants that most likely the majors are using at this time. And you can get lost pretty quickly, pretty fast. There's just, you don't have a lot of leverage with them. So depending on, you know, the size, you know, not knowing who's on the, you know, on the phone today, depending on your size and everything, you know, having a broker or going with a boutique plant that can kind of sort of hold your hand through this, at least the first few, I think is really important. And really, you know, hopefully you get something and you get a great education about it as well.
Yep. Now, Melanie, you've used probably every possible variation of this.
Totally. And I've even more this year have used every possible variation. And honestly, if I'm advising a young band who hasn't done it before, go to a boutique, go to a broker, go to someone who will hold your hand a little bit, just because you're going to forget stuff along the way. If you go to a manufacturing plant where you have to order the paper separate from the audio product, you're going to forget one of the two. And you also don't know which process, or sometimes it can be cheaper, sometimes it can be more expensive. If you go to a place that's going to do it all in-house for you, you don't have to worry about the rest of it. You don't have to stay super organized. And a lot of times, like we were saying earlier, these are artists. They're not thinking about those things. They're not staying on top of those things. They don't have someone like me who that's their main focus to ensure that that gets done and sent to the distributor. Like that's all I'm paying attention to. Meanwhile, an artist is paying attention to the marketing, the music, everything. They don't need to then worry themselves with having to do that whole process themselves. Let someone else handle it if you can afford to let someone else handle it.
Yep. We had a very specific question that came through, and I just want to address it because it was very pointed and specific, and we're kind of getting close to when we're going to wrap up. But does anyone have any thoughts about half speed? Is there a difference in improvement? Are there any cost factors that you'd add in there when you work with half speed mastering?
Well, typically half-speed mastering sounds a lot better, in my opinion. And you're really going now in the audiophile area. So if you're doing half-speed, I'm assuming, again, I mean, I don't want to get into debate about 33 RPM versus 45 RPM, but, you know, you're starting to get into that world of real audiophile. And, you know, I believe that, you know, you end up, you know, for me, again, you know, if it's a great piece of music, then it's worth paying the $7,500 for it. But, you know, that's just my, you know, that's just really a very subjective opinion on my part.
Yeah, the one time we had to do, so when we had the album that we had to take back all the albums because the needle was jumping out, we then had to go back and half-speed master it to make sure that audibly it sounded the way the artist intended, because the artist wanted a big, all-encompassing, bassy sound. So he ended up having to go with half-speed mastering.
And by the way, there's also a trick, because a lot of times, you know, what artists will do or labels will do is they'll do the half-speed master and release it at a high price. And 6 months later, you know, they say, well, we're just going to sell the normal release. Well, the normal release is also half speed because they haven't created a new master. If they want to pay for it, they just haven't told you about it. So sometimes you're willing to wait and you find out, you know, I won't name names, but there are actually releases out there that I know of where basically they've done the half speed master, say 6 months to 12 months prior to basically doing a general release, and it's basically the same master. So
to people who buy it early, don't buy it late.
Yeah. Yeah. As someone on the other side of that food chain, buy it as soon as you hear about it. Absolutely. Yeah. You want to make sure you get what you want, basically, and not have to take that chance.
Yeah, with the album that we did, the mastering engineer was like, can you please send me one that had the better mastering before they had to budget up.
Yeah. So listen, I want to thank everybody who was on the panel today. We want to be respectful of everybody's time and thank everybody who attended and logged in and some of your questions. If there were anything that we didn't get to, it looks like there are a few. We'll make sure that we get those out on the Making Vinyl site. And again, thanks to everybody who attended, and thanks to Melanie and Alex and Jean for working with us here. And thanks especially to Brian for pulling all this together and on pretty quick notice, getting all this technology to work relatively well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Chuck, to you also. I thought it was a great session. Love working with you guys, putting this together. A lot of great information that was shared. And I think, you know, the idea of us sharing information is just the most important thing. You know, we don't want this to be a mystery. We want this to be, we'll say, something that's embraced and that people could use more and more. So I really wish that we could have done this in person. We're going to do this in person one day again soon, but let's keep it alive doing it this way for now. Thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate it. Look forward to doing more.